We want to come to the last block in this 2 days agenda, or 1.5 days agenda. And as we said, we want to give a short report on what happened in the 3 workshops. I had the pleasure to visit all 3 of them, and I learned a lot from, I'll tell you afterwards. But there are 3 moderators, and they've been there for, these 2 hours, and maybe we could give some 5-minute introduction to what happened, and then, of course, the floor is open to questions and discussions. And I see a lot of people taking these beautiful pictures made by Gabriele Heinzel and Gabriele Schlipf, and this is something what we believe could help to bring down a discussion of 2 days in a complex discussion to pictures, because we believe that if you see what you've been discussing and if it looks nice and you make it a bit more colorful, that this could also be some interesting way to talk about science and talk about politics, not just in a written statement, some paper that everyone's only reading the executive summary of, but to really have it a bit more colorful and a bit more living. And we hope you'll like it, and this could be the basis for further discussion. So I would now like to hand on to Dr. David Jacobs. He's the member of our platform Energiewende team at the IASS, and he was the moderator of the first workshop, together with our colleague Inge Dinnes.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a very interesting workshop. It was a workshop on participatory methods and civic engagement in energy policy. We started with short presentations from experts from all the different countries. So we had one presentation from Germany on participation in grid extension planning in Germany. We had another presentation from Denmark, which was on community-based wind power and in how far the public is actually able to take a financial share in wind power projects in Denmark. We had an interesting presentation from Iceland as well. You already heard Bjarni Bjarnansen this morning. He explained once again in how far the public is involved in building geothermal power plants in Iceland. From Finland, we also heard about the acceptance of nuclear energy and how far the government actually managed to get people on board in still looking for this energy generation technology. We had an interesting presentation also from Norway, from Rune Flatby, on public participation in wind power licensing. And then we had an interesting presentation from Sweden on their best practices and failures in managing to integrate the public into the energy policy making. So after these very interesting short presentations, we had a very vivid discussions, and I just will try to summarize some of the takeaways. Of course, when you talk about energy policies in 6 different countries, there's quite a lot of differences. So I don't want to overlook them, so stress at least some of them. There's definitely some differences in the type of countries we're looking at. There's differences, for instance, in population density. In a country like Iceland, it is not so much an issue to get acceptance for new grid infrastructure than in a highly densely populated country like Germany. This is very obvious, but it is very important for making your choices in energy policy. There's also differences in energy infrastructure. We heard that Sweden and Denmark, for instance, have very good district heating systems, and therefore they can combine the heating and electricity sector much more strongly than other countries can do it, where electricity and heating are not as far interlinked. We also learned about differences of technologies, that for instance, you have solar photovoltaic, where participation is rather easy, where you can probably talk of as solar PV being one of the most democratic technologies, because all participants can actually be involved, can buy their own solar PV system, put it on their rooftop. Then you have wind energy. We have several countries like Germany and Denmark, for instance, where public participation also in financing small and big scale wind power plants is actually already rather high. Then you have other technologies like geothermal, where you have a lot of risk involved, because you have this drilling risk. You can never be sure whether you can really tap into a pocket in the earth where you can get enough heat to make the power plant work. So this is normally then financed by state-owned companies and not so much co-financed by private persons or even individuals. And then, of course, you have nuclear energy, where again, financing is much more capital intensive. And still, we have learned from Finland that the nuclear power plants are partly financed by some actors, and these are big actors. These are municipalities and the energy-intensive industry, which is holding financial shares in the new nuclear power plants. So there is some participation, but the actors that participate in different power generation technologies are different due to the source, due to the very nature of each technology. We also learned that there's differences in the energy mix. Some countries like Finland and Germany are energy importers, electricity importers, and therefore their policy making is of course much different than those of countries which are electricity exporters like Denmark. We also learned during the last couple of days that the German targets are very ambitious, 80% until 2050. However, the Nordic countries, all of them, actually have much higher shares of renewable energy already today, and therefore the need for them to increase renewables is different, and there's also different aspects of system and market integration which have to be taken into account. One debate I found very interesting was a debate on the culture of policymaking in different countries. There was one argument saying that some countries like Finland and Sweden, where the examples given, are more authoritarian, or not authoritarian, but more authoritative, more top-down policy making, and therefore also energy policy making is more on a top-down basis, whereas Central European countries like Germany and Spain have a more of a dialogue, argumentative dialogue process, bottom-up, and therefore also policy decisions are more based on dialogues which are taking place between different actors, and therefore one might also think that there's different sorts of innovations coming from a top-down based energy system than from a bottom-up based energy system. We also identified quite a lot of common best practices in different countries, in the 6 countries we have discussed, so I just want to mention a few of them. One of the very essential features of any support framework for renewable energies or for a more sustainable energy system altogether is, of course, information. So you need to have the information that the decision that you're making publicly, having a new transmission line being erected somewhere, having a new wind power plant, is actually connected to the bigger picture of climate change, of environmental protection that you have in a given country. If you're not able to tell this story as a policymaker, as a decision maker to your people, you will probably have hard times of getting any sort of participation or of acceptance of your new energy system. So has been pointed out as being very crucial. We also learned that all countries have consultation processes in grid planning, in energy generation planning. However, a common problem is that consultations take place. However, policymakers don't listen enough. So they might listen, but then they don't act accordingly. So there's no point in making long-lasting consultations when then you just listen to people, but you don't act accordingly. We heard, for instance, from Sweden, where there was a referendum on nuclear power. People decided that nuclear should be phased out by 2010. However, policymakers continue to work with nuclear power, and this decision has not been taken for granted. And this also happens on a smaller scale with transmission lines in Germany, wind power in Norway, etc. A very important component of any sort of participation is also the taxation scheme in different countries. We learned, for instance, that there was competition in Finland on where nuclear plants should be located because municipalities would benefit largely from the taxation, from the taxes that nuclear power producers would have to pay. The same is actually the case in Germany, where 70% of the revenues from a wind power producer go to the location where the power plant is located, so to the actual village where the wind power plant is located. And this has been very crucial for getting acceptance in the communities for wind power in Germany. So I think we can still learn a lot from each other in how far taxation can actually have an influence on public acceptance. Another crucial factor for public engagement is, of course, ownership. We learned from Denmark that any onshore wind power park in Denmark, 20% of it has to be owned by the local public. I think Denmark is a very exceptional case in this. We learned also that this share should actually be higher. It should more be in the range of 60% to really get the public engaged and increase acceptance. We also have other countries where there's high shares of ownership from private households, from small and medium-sized companies. Like in Germany, 50% of all renewable energy installations are owned by these type of actors. However, when you make it legally binding by law that a certain share of a given power plant should be owned by the public, should be owned by the local people, you will certainly be able to increase acceptance. Last but not least, we talked about compensation, that landowners and municipalities should, for instance, get financial compensation if a power generation plant is located next to them, or if a transmission line is going through the village. We also talked about the fact that this kind of financial compensation might not always work. There was actually some studies done in Germany. In Germany, when you now build a new transmission line through a village, I think you get for each kilometer that is built, you get 40,000 euros as a compensation as a village when you're located next to it. However, this compensation was not always seen positively by the people really being affected, because they thought they would be kind of bribed or bought by the government for accepting that this transmission line is really being built in their village. So instead of giving them financial compensation, people normally prefer to be involved in the actual decision-making process where the transmission line is running through which area, instead of getting financial compensation. So there's this kind of interesting pros and cons for it. To summarize, we talked a lot about national aspects that could help to increase acceptance. However, many speakers also pointed out that there should be a European component, that we should no longer consider the Energiewende as a Nordic way or as a German way. We should really think of it as a European project. And I think one comment was very interesting. It was said that low electricity prices in the Nordic market are actually not due to the technologies that have been chosen for power generation, nuclear power, wind energy, whatever be it. It is actually due to market integration and to cooperation. Since you are now an integrated market and you have interconnection line with several countries in the region, you have been able to lower investments into backup capacity, you have been able to lower investments into national grid extension, rather looking at regional markets, and therefore regional cooperation or European cooperation can actually make the Energiewende, the European Energiewende, less expensive. And I think this is a nice closing remark for what we've discussed at our workshop. What also has been stressed is that there should be more trust between policymakers and people, and this is of course very crucial for any kind of decision making, and this should also be taken into account when discussing the European perspective. So that was it in a nutshell. I hope it was not too much information in a very short time. I hand over to my colleagues.
It was a big and bright nutshell. Thanks so much, David. I think we first do the same for the other two workshops and then have questions all together, so to start a better discussion then. Dr. Petri Hakkarainen for the second workshop, please.
Well, thank you. We moderated this together with my colleague Dolores Volkert here, and our topic was green conflicts of interest. And I think quite often when it's a bit like the reference to a good question yesterday in the discussion, when people talk about an interesting discussion, it's quite often that they don't find much else to say about it. But ours was genuinely interesting, as you can see from the two sheets full of drawings from it. Our starting point was to look at the so-called green conflicts of interest. In a small, tiny nutshell, we mean by it the necessary resources and an infrastructure for a greener and a low carbon energy future, and how they quite often clash with other green values, be it nature protection, conservation, or simply also we talked quite a lot about the NIMBY effect at our workshop as well. Now we started the discussion with a good introduction to the German situation by Carsten Wachholz from the German conservation organization NABU. And he gave us a very, very broad overview based on a recent collaboration with other German environmental NGOs on on the current or future green conflicts which have something to do with the Energiewende. And it was really a broad range of issues. Basically, we ended up noticing that more or less each and every single energy source also provides a green conflict, as do also the transmission lines and the whole grid expansion. And that, I think, was a good starting point for the discussion, where then we had Scandinavian and Nordic contributions to the debate as well, where we tried to then focus more on the possible solutions to it. And a couple of things one could perhaps draw from that. One important point was the distinction between genuine conservation issues, questions where it's really about nature conservation and be it biodiversity or other elements of it. And then on the other hand, everything that we now label under NIMBYism, the not in my backyard phenomenon. And that is something that we should always discuss pretty closely, not to label everything under being a NIMBY effect. There are genuine conservation issues involved as well. Well, there was a clear distinction between two sides of the story. In that sense, you have the transmission lines on the one hand, and then you have the energy sources on the other hand. And quite interestingly, the only energy source that didn't really figure in the debate in these terms was solar and PV. And that's actually the only one that also the environmental NGOs at the moment in Germany agree. There is not really anything on the horizon coming, to a large extent because the capacity is almost already there. There's no large scale new land use planned for solar PV in the future. Now, coming to the possible solutions to all of these conflicts, we had quite a lengthy discussion on the role of legislation on the one hand, and then financial incentives on the other hand, which would be the best way to guide and lead the solution to the right direction. I'm not sure if we really came to a conclusion between the two. There was also a reference to not all we need is love, but all we need is more engineers. But let's see. There was not a common consensus on that either. I think there's some need for love as well. But what we more or less agreed on, each and every one of us, was the need for more communication. That's communication and education, and trying to paint a bigger picture. That comes again very close to what David just mentioned from workshop 1, and that's of course a very challenging task. Trying to paint a big picture in a very local and small environment, because the issues often have something to do with very local costs in all senses of the word, and then in order to move beyond these obstacles, I think we all agree that there's a need for more positive stories, more of the big picture, and I think all the actors are responsible for delivering that. It's not only the role of the media, it's not only the role of the politicians, but all sectors involved in this conference as well are somehow responsible for delivering that message. I mean, if we are serious about tackling climate change issues, we will need to overcome some of these trade-offs and these potential conflicts. So I think we ended up on much more of a positive note in spite of the title, which we consciously chose to provoke debate. I think we ended up with less conflicts and more about a positive narrative that we all need to overcome this.
Thank you very much. And especially good for the engineers, because all we need is to love engineers even more. Fine. So last but not least, the third workshop, and this was a bit different because it was about grassroots ideas, and the average age of the workshop participants was much lower because we had young people there, eight young people that quit school or university yesterday and today. Thanks for doing this. I hope the conference was more exciting than sitting in school for 2 days, and it was. And it was very exciting for us to listen to your workshop, and maybe Ulrich Mans, who's also a member of our TPEC team, can give a short report on that.
I will. And just out of principle, I'm just going to stand up because it was meant to be a little bit of a different workshop from the rest of the conference. To pick up on a word of David, he said there's a difference in top-down policies in some of the Nordics countries, for example. In our workshop, we would have considered everything we have discussed for the last 2 days top-down. And the idea of the workshop, grassroots ideas for the future, was particularly to say, okay, let's have a look at those people who haven't been part of the decision of the Energiewende or any energy policy in any of the countries we discuss. And we invited our 8 colleagues, now colleagues, who've presented. They spent 2 days thinking about what they like about different initiatives they found. And they came up with 5 different initiatives. We presented them to the different groups and small subgroups. We had a discussion. And just a couple of highlights. To give you an idea, the initiatives were one school project where a solar panel project was put up through crowdfunding. They raised the money through the people in school. Another project was the Earth Hour, and we asked the question, okay, for the Earth Hour, how many people actually do with it? How much money or how much energy and CO2 can you save? And how do you increase that? And what effect does that have? Is that an awareness raising issue, or is it really an energy saving issue, or is it both? We had a discussion on this. We had one other initiative that basically looked at the competition Jugend forscht. In Germany, people probably know it. It's a science competition for youngsters who can win prizes if they come up with innovative ideas. And the question we asked, what happens if you win the prize? Everybody claps on your shoulder and say, okay, fine, nicely done, sit down. What happens to those innovations? What happens to those ideas? The other initiative we had was nutrition. In Berlin, we have a vegetarian Mensa, a canteen for university students which only offers vegetarian meals. And one of the questions we had, is that useful to have whole Germany being fed vegetarian? How much CO2 can you actually save, etc.? And how could you move towards a system where you have people choose once a week, twice a week to have vegetarian food instead, and how much impact would that make? And the last initiative was about carpooling. People who don't have driver's lessons today might have to consider buying a car, but they might consider doing something else. Why would they do that? What are the kind of triggers for a 17-year-old today to have a driver's license, yes or no, to do car sharing, carpooling, etc.? What are these issues? And that was all driven by the idea that energy saving, energy efficiency, energy production, renewable energy, etc., it's all nice and fine, but for that generation, the U20 generation, as we could call them, they said, no, 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 for us, it's about a change of common sense, behavioral change. And how do you do that? And how do you do that with grassroots, not top down? And one of the key things, I mean, we basically in the workshop we said it's about you, me, and now. It's not about policy. It's not about changing things in 5 years. It's not about phasing out nuclear in 2022. That's something that happens in political capitals, federal capitals, whatever. But you, me, now. What can you do? What can I do? Not tomorrow, now. And it happened. Well, in the workshop, I mean, we had quite interesting discussions, and there were very few concrete ideas actually on how to do that properly and what makes people move. But there are, of course, interesting examples. I'm just going to give you 2 examples from Norway and from Sweden. We had 2 presenters from Friends of the Earth, Norway, and Greenpeace in Sweden. And in Sweden, for example, it's an interesting case where Facebook users were elemental to make Facebook invest in a green data center in Sweden. Think about it. Facebook users pushing a large corporation to invest in green data centers. In Norway, local fishermen actually moved and engaged in a way that there was a broad movement against an oil exploration platform, saving local fish, not only for the local fishermen, but also for all the people in the rest of Norway who want to buy the fish. Coming back to that later on. Another idea actually we developed during the workshop, give you one example, is going back to the science competition. if it is true that we spend millions of euros in Germany making 16-year-olds come up with nice ideas of which we know they're not going to do anything in the end, but they create awareness, and we're probably happy about the fact that 16-year-olds have done something that is sustainable or engaged in sustainability. But wouldn't it be more useful to have a competition that brings things, that creates things, that facilitates innovation, that can be used? For example, you have a marketing prize. You have a competition for how do you engage youth in the Energiewende prize. And the winners of that, they'll get money to do it. Because nobody's going to say, well, this is unrealistic to do that. If they win the prize and it's about youth engagement, you better give them money to do that. So maybe there's other ways of looking at the instruments we already have and the type of money that's already been spent for these kind of grassroots ideas. Just to give you an idea, at the end of the workshop, we asked our students, sort of, okay, if you having listened to all this, presented and discussed, and what actually makes you move? What makes you move? Why are you here? I mean, basically, we paid the train ticket and we paid the hostel, but I mean, why are you here? And they come up with a range of things, and that's quite interesting, and relates back to the success criteria we could actually distill from all this. Now, I want to propose 3 success criteria we sort of distill out of our workshop. 1, simplicity. It's an open door. Be simple in your message. If people don't understand what you're saying, if people don't understand what the problem is, they're not going to come up with something they can do about it. 2, diversity. 100 people have 100 motivations. If we asked the 8 students to come up with their motivations, 8 students came up with 7 motivations. Egoism, peers, friends. Egoism, just to explain that, egoism, if it's good for yourself, you might as well do it. Whether it's a health issue, whether it's because it's fun, etc. We had being a good example as a motivation. We had having a vision as a motivation. We had facts driving motivation. We had fear as motivation, fear for future problems. And we had being heard. I just want to stand still quickly on being heard. It's important to talk to those who will live up to see 2030, 2040, 2050. And many of the people who are taking decisions today are not those people. And we're only starting to actually reach out to that generation. And the people we invited for this conference is only a very tiny fraction of that. And the people who are 14 years old, 12 years old, 10 years old, 7 years old, they might as well have their opinions already, or they're being shaped today. And we can do much better in thinking about this. Why would people move to do and to engage in energy policy? And the third success criteria, we had simplicity, we had diversity, and the third, I'm adding, we didn't really talk about this, it sort of came in, but I'm just going to add it, and I would call it, it's close to your bedroom. It has to affect you. It has to affect you. We all know that if we have a good reason to do something, literally if we can't buy the local fish because there's pollution in that sea where the fish comes from, it's a problem. And it reaches, of course, all levels of life. With these 3 success criteria, I would like to leave you, and I'm pretty sure we're going to discuss a couple of those issues. But again, just a plenary, maybe applause for the 8 students who worked night and day for the last 2 days on doing this.
Thank you so much. And there was one thing I noted. One said the human race is not mature yet. And that was a harsh thing, but I think we should think about this. I looked to you, Mr. Ambassador. We're a bit behind the schedule. If this is okay for you, I would just open for some more questions, because I think there have to be a lot of questions of this very good introductions about the results of the workshops. So if there are, please address questions or comments from your workshops to start to connect these three issues.
I can also just add one thing, which apparently was a common theme for all of this, is exactly that of being heard, and of being listened to. That's something that came up really strongly in our discussion as well. When we talk about participation, I think it was expressed in the group. The worst option is actually to try to engage people and have them participate when you do it at such a late stage that there is no participation. So if you talk about the dialogue, you have to talk about it honestly, and then when you enter into a dialogue, you also create expectation for the other side, and then you have to talk and listen. That's what the dialogue is about.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, please.
Well, it's just a comment. When you talk about district heating and integration of wind and solar in this, it sometimes sounds as if you think the Nordic countries has as a part of its nature pipes for water in the ground. All district heating system has been built, and they have been built due to a policy making it possible to build them with public guarantee, for instance. And the same thing could be the case in Germany. If you want it, you can get it, and you can make a policy that makes it happen. So, and I think that in order to integrate a lot of wind power, you need to integrate heat and electricity, and wind and also solar power cooling system. So it's not like mountains. It's something that has been built, and it can be built also in Germany.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's one statement or question up there.
Yes, it's a comment on another aspect that I think is very important in this whole Wende, because it comes down to economy. And I think that it's one thing that can really help you to bridge the gap is to get the energy-intensive industry or other parts of the industry with you in the Wende. And I think it's been very important that, for instance, IG Metall in Germany is behind it, and while in Sweden we have a completely different situation. So to really make sure that the big energy-intensive industry is behind, because then the whole race will run much more smooth.
Was that part of the discussion, like participatory methods, not only with private people or political parties or stakeholders, but about industry participation? I mean, you can say that's the very important approach to get things running. Other people say, well, it's just about lobbying and just about bringing their own ideas through. Was that a part?
Well, that was an interesting example I mentioned already from Finland, that actually building the nuclear reactors was actually co-financed by some of the large industry members, by the energy-intensive industry and by the municipalities. So what we see on a smaller scale for renewable energies in other countries, like for wind energy in Denmark, for biogas in Germany, you see it on a larger scale happening for nuclear in Finland. And then well, we didn't really discuss all too much the German exceptions for the energy-intensive industry, which we have, which actually is one of the major reasons why energy-intensive industry, at least parts of them, are not too critical of the Energiewende. Let's put it this way, because they are financial. They are not as the financial burden of them is not as strong as on private households, for instance. However, there is, of course, currently a debate going on in Germany whether these financial exceptions for the energy-intensive industry are not too high, and that they should actually take a higher share of the burden in order to, well, co-finance the Energiewende, at least to a certain extent. So I think Germany is maybe an interesting case, but not really a best practice example of how energy-intensive industry is supporting the Energiewende. I think there is still some room for improvement here.
Just one quick additional point to that. We touched upon a related topic in our discussion as well, and that was the trust in companies as well, and trust in big energy companies, which in a way is an important aspect of pulling this through. And as long as there is an absence of that trust, for whatever reason that may be, there are certain problems ahead as well.
And just to say one quote that I took from the second workshop, it's also about costs and the rising costs through the EEG from yesterday, meaning that 60 euros a year or 5 euros a month. And there was a comparison that 5 euros a month is only one big beer, or in small beer in Norway. So just to get the relations right, it is some contribution, and of course there are people, for them 60 euros is a lot, of course, but just to bring this into some analogy to other things, maybe it is worth to spend these things, yeah. One question up there.
Yeah, I am one of those students, and in our workshop we put forward that making or fear is driving us to get out of our armchairs and do something. And I find it very interesting that in the workshop of Petri and Tobias, they say in capital, focus on the positive. That's the exact opposite, and I find it very interesting to see, okay, that for us, we have like the dark vision that drives us, and on the other hand, it's like the positive thing motivates us at some point. So I think it's very difficult to get some kind of analogy from those two to get us really doing something. I find it interesting.
Well, just a quick comment on that. I think that the two motivations are actually related. I mean, our focusing on the positive was very much about focusing on the positive effects of the energy transformation, for instance, as a way of avoiding the negative, as a way of avoiding the cause of fear in that way. So there is a relation, but of course, I mean, it's a different definition of the same situation. But still, it all relates back to the need to communicate the big picture. And that again puts the costs as well in perspective. If you're able to communicate that the costs of not doing anything are in the end a lot higher than the cost of doing something, then that might have a better prospect of being realized.
Talking about fear or the positive movements, it's also a question about media. Only good news is only bad news are good news. So this is what you often hear if things get too expensive or things do not work. But there are lots of positive examples that there might be. There, well, pretty rarely information about this. So this might be another workshop next time. Are there more questions or comments from you? Okay, then I would like to say thank you to all the moderators and organizers of these workshops, and of course to you who participated and discussed this. Thank you so much. I would like to hand over for the last words to the ambassador of Iceland again. I would just say thank you from the perspective of the IASS. It was a great pleasure to being the co-host of this conference together with the 5 embassies. And like Mr. Bachmann said yesterday, the raison d'être of our institute is to link science to stakeholders, to politics, to industry, to NGOs. And I hope that yesterday and today, well, was exactly doing this. So thank you very much.